Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's seminar. It's hybrid, so there are people joining us online and also in the room. I'll start again in case that didn't work. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's seminar of the Migration Policy Centre at the EUI. This is a hybrid seminar, so we're happy to welcome people in the room and also people joining us online via YouTube. We're very happy to welcome today Dr. Richa Shivakoti, who is Research Area Lead on International Labour Migration in the Canada Excellence Research Chair on Migration and Integration at Toronto Met University. So very happy that Richa has been here with us as a visiting fellow for the last month as part of an exchange that we have with the CERC at Toronto Met. Richa's had a very varied research career with affiliations in Nepal, Singapore, the Netherlands, Canada, and the US. Rich experience. And today, the topic of her presentation is on the migration ban policy cycle, comparative analysis of restrictions on the emigration of women domestic workers. So we're very happy to welcome Richa. The seminar will last for an hour. There'll be around 30 minutes of presentation, 30 minutes for Q&A. And those who are joining us online are very welcome to ask questions, but must do so via the chat box on YouTube, and we can then put the questions that way. So without further ado, very happy to welcome Richa and hand over to her.
Right. Yeah, the slides are not working. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for joining me here and everyone online. I just wanted to say thank you to the Migration Policy Centre for having me as an exchange fellow here from Canada. I am currently researching issues related to labor migration in Asia, and that is something that I'll be presenting today. I also just wanted to mention the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. I know there's also an exchange from here that you can go to come visit us. So if anyone would like to talk to me about that, I'd be very happy to talk about it. It's okay. So today I'm presenting a paper that I co-authored with my colleagues, Sophie Henderson and Matt Withers. It's about comparative analysis of the restriction of emigration of women domestic workers from South and Southeast Asian countries, mostly to the Middle East, that have happened, since really quite a while, since the 80s. So these bans have happened since the early 1980s. Is when we saw it in by the government of Bangladesh for several kinds of low-skilled migrant workers, especially women, and they've been on and off periodically since then, adopted by several labor-sending countries. So usually there are bans on women going to certain countries or sectors, usually lower skilled. And the most common reasoning for why there are these kind of migration bans is because the thinking that women domestic workers are more vulnerable to abuse or mistreatment. And in recent times, the ones that we've seen is Cambodia has had one in 2011, Sri Lanka in 2013, Nepal in 2014, Indonesia in 2015, and this policy has come back over time.
Sorry, don't run the power laptop.
It was working, yeah. Okay, sure. I'll take away. Sorry, Andrew, you need to do that, otherwise I'm not.
Just to explain, we've got a slight technical difficulty with the PowerPoint for those online, so if you could just bear with us, we'll try and get the slides up, because I think it's making it more difficult for Richa to make her presentation, so we will just take a little bit of time to get things working. There we go. So I think that takes the Richa having to kind of explain without the benefit of slides. Now we can take the pressure off a little bit. So back over to you, Richa.
Okay, so I was starting the presentation on just explaining what migration bans are. So they're basically policies banning migrant women from certain sectors or countries, and the rationale has always been it is to protect them from abuse or mistreatment while they work abroad. And it's been long-standing policy response, especially seen after high-profile cases of abuse faced by migrant domestic workers, usually in the Middle East. And it's also because the Middle East remains the largest destination for domestic workers from South and Southeast Asia. As I said earlier, it has a long history with, the first ones we know of is from the government of Bangladesh, and it's been on and off from 1981 to 1998. And we've seen it come again and again at different forms in different countries. So, it's interesting to understand why this is the case. So, a lot of the academic attention is usually comparative analysis of policy regimes governing international migration of immigration in the OECD countries in the West, but there's been a lot less research focusing on immigration from the developing countries. But the reality is the most of the world's international migrants now move between countries in the global South. So we wanted to understand why these migration bans or restrictions on women domestic workers are quite common, but also controversial. And because they've remained under-researched, we decided to look into the history of these bans on 4 prominent labor-sending countries in South and Southeast Asia: Indonesia, Nepal, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, to understand and assess the causes, outcomes, and extent of regional convergence of these policies. And we look at these countries because of both similarities and differences. The obvious similarities is just the large prevalence of temporary labor migration from these countries, as it's used as a livelihood strategy for poor households in each country, because of absence of substantial local employment opportunities, and also the significant remittances that are sent back to these countries. There are also some important differences. So for Nepal and Sri Lanka, the labor migration has primarily been involved in low-wage employment sectors, in oil-producing sectors, economies of the Gulf. And for Nepal, even though the official statistics indicate that the numbers are quite low, it's also because of these bans that they cannot be counted, right? So it's seen in Nepal to be more male-dominated, whereas in Sri Lanka, it's highly feminized, and it has been the majority of departures from Sri Lanka have been female domestic workers before the introduction of these restrictions that happened in 2013. For temporary labor migration from Indonesia and Philippines, it's more diverse. It's very highly feminized, but more diverse in terms of the destination countries they go to, as well as the occupation profiles of the workers. So Indonesian migrant workers have been quite split between the Gulf countries and the Southeast Asian countries, other countries in the region. Before the introduction of the ban in 2011, to the Gulf countries specifically. There also work some in manufacturing industries, whereas Filipino migrant workers have been quite diverse in their occupations. We know a lot about the nurses and caregiving, skilled caregivers in different countries, also in Europe. But still the vast majority is domestic workers across Asia, Europe, and other regions. So we wanted to look at the policy origins, and we highlight two cross-cutting themes, which are the feminization of employment and the politicization of gender norms as prevalent themes that inform the origins of these bans. So feminization not only implies increases in female labor force participation, but also there's a substantive alteration to the gender division of labor itself. So, there are examples could be like a concentration of women workers in particular industries or occupations, feminization of jobs traditionally performed by men, and also the basic precarity of work that happens in these kind of sectors. So feminization is more of a process of labor market segmentation and deregulation than it is of gender rebalancing in the participation of paid work. So we also understand feminization of employment through the proliferation of domestic worker migration similarly, and that it has become one of the largest occupational categories for women in each of these countries. But like sewing garments, domestic work is kind of framed as an extension of feminine work in their households, and also unpaid care work. And it's also considered unskilled. So short-term and low-wage work especially in West Asia, which is the Gulf countries, they also take place where there are very limited rights on workers because of the kafala system, which has very strict limitations on what women or workers in general can do and cannot do. But also in the earlier years, Singapore and Hong Kong also had quite rigid features, and still do. So in the country of destination, also they have these difficulties. So domestic worker migration across Asia thus has been a form of feminized employment and has some typical features, which include an increase in female breadwinners in the societies, their accompanying tensions with the established gender norms, and devaluation of women's labor, but also understanding the difficulties while they work transnationally. So the other theme is the politicization of gender norms. So again, the emergence of female breadwinners is often in conflict because traditionally gendered ideals have depicted men to be the breadwinners, while women are usually in the household as nurturing mothers and wives. So because of the emergence of female breadwinners, but also alongside male employment, especially in rural areas, have kind of lessened over time. This has put these gender norms under stress, and there's some stigma related to women workers who go abroad to work. And these patriarchal familial ideology has also been explicitly incorporated into state policy because there's this unease of women workers going abroad for work. So for example, in Sri Lanka and in Indonesia, there is a requirement that women obtain permission from their spouse or male guardian in order for them to migrate overseas as domestic workers. So even though the state encourages migration and remittances, there's also this reluctance. So in some ways, when women workers go abroad, they're still in this familial frame that they put them as, they're economic heroes, or they're doing this duty for their family and their well-being of the country. That sort of thing is kind of narrated. So we look at the migration bans in these countries, and obviously there are variations among them, but we suggest that it is possible to identify a generalizable model of migration ban policy cycles, because in most cases we see that they're often catalyzed by a crisis event, and there's some form of contestation and negotiation that happens, and towards that, and usually there's a corrective policy change. So the crisis event, we wanted to kind of show a few of them, because the same country can have the bans come back again and again after certain crisis event. And these are examples in each of the 4 countries that we study. So usually the crisis event is abuse or a death of a woman migrant worker during foreign employment. And this kind of event becomes this, results in a lot of media and public attention or public outrage. So as you can see, the examples in each of these countries, like for example, in the Philippines, the 1995 case of the execution of complexities in Singapore has resulted in a lot of the policy changes and has become really an important issue, like a big event in the country's policy history, let's say. But in other countries, it's not resulted in this large-scale policy change in a lot of other ways. So usually during a crisis event, the labor sending state must choose very quickly among a limited set of policy options. And this is something that I looked into another paper earlier. And there's some policy options that they can do, which is to do nothing. And usually that has worked. For countries, they kind of wait until the crisis blows over, some other event comes in the news, and people, it's not the focus of public attention. The other option is to find a diplomatic solution with the country. This is a more difficult option because there's significant power imbalance between the labor sending and receiving countries. And the third option is something that we've seen is a total or a partial ban on migration of women domestic workers with the rationale of protecting them. And while the third option seems to be the most extreme, it's actually a quite convenient policy in their policy toolkit, because the government appears to be decisive, having done something, appears to be, but it kind of mollifies public anger for the time being, but it actually doesn't require the government to do much. They put this ban, and then it's kind of on the women to figure it out, what they do, what they don't do. And if the women still go and there is cases of abuse or something, the government can kind of say, oh, we told you not to go, and you still did it. So it's kind of shifting the blame on the migrant worker itself. And to give an example of how difficult it is for someone to understand the changes that happen, I wanted to show this example from Nepal on how it has changed over time. There are bans on different countries, different sectors, different times, different age. So if you're less than 30, and then if later becomes if you're less than 24, and things like that. So the stage 2 of the policy ban cycle we talk about is policy confusion and resistance. Because of the changing nature of these bans, it's quite difficult for migrant workers to understand and keep on top of it what the law is in general. So over time, in practice, what happens is the migration bans are counter to what was intended to protect them, because it basically closes the legal avenues for migration for women, and it pushes them towards migrating irregularly. And it is well documented that when women or men migrant workers go, bypass regular migration channels, they become more vulnerable to rights violations and abuse during their recruitment and while overseas. They also do not have access to pre-departure information or training issues given by the government or others, or standard employment contracts and such. And also recruitment agencies can benefit from it and profit because of their irregular status. So the third stage that we suggest is labor diplomacy, and it is, as I said, very difficult because of the bargaining imbalance in power between countries of origin and destination. But like countries like Indonesia and Philippines, who have a little bit more of a bargaining power, have occasionally managed to negotiate better working terms and right protection for migrant workers through MOUs or bilateral agreements, and then they lift the ban after there's some agreement. For example, the Philippines used the threat of a migration ban on domestic workers to negotiate a bilateral agreement with Saudi Arabia in 2012, which secured better labor protection and also a minimum monthly wage of $400 US, despite reluctance from Saudi Arabia. But again, it's important to understand that there might be a new agreement, but it is quite difficult for the monitoring and implementation, especially in domestic work. And these are non-binding agreements for the most part. And finally, at some point, there is usually a policy change or reversal of these migration bans. And it's, because negotiation becomes too difficult. There's also labor sending states are at a structural labor market disadvantage. They have weak bargaining power, and host countries really don't have that incentive to, actively change their own laws to improve certain conditions, because there are an abundance of labor supplying countries. And this kind of fear that they might go and hire migrant workers from another country is well-founded. In some cases, for example, Saudi Arabia, in several occasions, has gone to different African countries like Ethiopia or Kenya, after countries like Philippines or Sri Lanka have imposed these kind of bans. And these labor sending countries are also quite dependent on remittances, and there's also quite strong criticism from human rights, migrant rights groups and things like that. So there's usually a policy reversion that we see over time. We don't have too much time, so I do want to just quickly touch upon the 4 countries that we looked at. The Philippines has the largest concentration of overseas Filipino workers in domestic work. Remittance, is almost 10% of the GDP. They've worked through labor diplomacy in some cases that we talked about earlier. The first worldwide ban from the Philippines was in 1988, and it was quite a mixed response, because some countries made the process of getting visas for all Filipinos much harder because of this, while other countries signed bilateral agreements, things like that. And these, the government has used bans in different countries in these years, like Singapore, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, most recently twice in Kuwait. In Indonesia, by 2007, women made up 79% of Indonesian migrant workers, so it's highly feminized. They make significant contributions through remittances. The government introduced a ban in 2009 to Malaysia, but because of a high-profile abuse case, but it was lifted in 2011. But the execution of an Indonesian domestic worker in Saudi Arabia in 2011 really prompted the government to impose a ban on domestic workers. And in 2012, it actually announced that they would stop sending domestic workers altogether by 2017. This has not happened, but this was announced quite publicly. In 2015, the government extended its ban to 21 countries in West Asia and East Africa. And this is quite interesting that President Joko Widodo kind of expressed political humiliation, declaring that the deployment of women domestic workers is a dent in Indonesia's pride and dignity. So there's this constant unease that women are going. They say they're going to stop it, but that hasn't happened. For Nepal, it's kind of recent, the migration of labor migration, and it's become quite large because almost 30% of the GDP is actually from remittances. Even though the official data states that only 5% of the labor approvals in the last decade went to women, because of these bans, women cannot get labor approvals. So, obviously the numbers are not correct. There was this high-profile case of a death of a worker in Kuwait, resulted in a ban in 1998. And as I showed in the table, there have been many policy changes over time. And usually women have continued migrating for work. And it's usually through the open border from India. There's an open border that you can go to, and that's how it has happened. For Sri Lanka, housemaids have, it's been quite a large segment of the foreign employment. From Sri Lanka, also remittances has been quite high, but the 2013 execution of a young domestic worker in Saudi Arabia really changed a lot of things. Initially, it provoked a lot of outrage of the abuse, but it soon, the discussions kind of moved to the families that they leave behind, and this resulted in a implementation of a conditional ban on migrant domestic workers known as the Family Background Report. It imposed a minimum age restriction on migrant domestic workers to different countries, and also placed an outright ban on migration of women with children under the age of 5. And women with children older than 5 were also then required to complete the report and also identify a proper female guardian and attain spousal consent, which then is subject to government inspection and approval. So this was quite a change in their policy. Do you have 5 minutes or so? Okay. So because these bans have come over, on and off in many countries, these kind of comparative analysis of these bans, we find that the countries of origin have to balance how they appease patriarchal norms in the home while also considering the economic consequences of labor migration for the country. And this policy allows for a performative change to satisfy the public without, really addressing the root cause of the problem. In the 4 countries, we can see policy convergence and divergence. From that, we find that there are 2 prominent policy narratives that come in. One is of labor diplomacy, and the other is of the patriarchal state as a protector. So in recent years, the Philippines has been seen as the clearest example of using the ban as a diplomatic negotiation form. It has used the ban to also signal to its own citizens, the Filipino citizens, that it is committed to taking strong actions and protecting migrant workers, which is a large segment of the population. And it has also negotiated and signed the most bilateral agreements and MOUs after exerting some diplomatic pressures. The Philippines' strong bargaining power is also because of the labor demand on, the well-educated, English-speaking, modern-appearing Filipino migrant worker who are kind of preferred in certain ways over other migrant workers. However, even though some negotiations have been successful, it doesn't always result in implementation of systematic change, and does not prevent future exploitations and death, as we see these bans coming up again and again. So a lot of the MOUs do not have that teeth because they're not easily implemented, especially for domestic work. The later narrative of the patriarchal state, we can see that in Nepal and Sri Lanka. And both countries have a more fragile market position. They came into this as labor sending states. They started a bit later, let's say, than Philippines or Indonesia too. And they also have less bargaining power with the receiving states. In Nepal, there's quite a stigma of women who go work abroad because of issues related to trafficking or prostitution. Also, irregular migration kind of puts them in certain positions. For Sri Lanka, it used to be such a large percentage of their workers, but this public discourse and state policy has really shifted because of the changes in 2013 and the FBR report, which has very recently been changed. They said they're going to make some changes to that, but also maybe also because of the economic state the country is in right now and how important remittances are. For Indonesia, we see that there's kind of both approaches of the narrative, because the government's bargaining power is gradually increasing as it's become a very dominant share, especially in Malaysia, neighboring country. And they have had certain different negotiations that they've stopped domestic workers from going, and then had negotiations to improve conditions. Similarly, for Malaysia and Saudi Arabia, they've had some changes in negotiation, and they've been allowed to keep their passports, communicate with their families, and a day of rest, which kind of seems like a minimal thing you would expect, but this requires some negotiation. But then there's also this issue of the gender norms and what is expected. So it's the country and society is still quite uncomfortable of the large number of female migrant workers going abroad to work. So we see different the states are motivated because of these challenges within how to reaffirm patriarchal gender norms, while also thinking about the economic gain for the country as a whole. And even though it is understood that this policy is ineffective in restricting mobility, it's also an easy option that I discussed earlier. So I think I kind of touched into these kind of issues already on how the Philippines has been able to use these to negotiate. And even though both approaches are quite limited in their ability to make any lasting change, this is something that is still used quite frequently and seen in different countries So you can see some form of policy learning that is happening between countries to adopt this policy. It's really difficult to make substantial change in the labor receiving countries because of their laws, and countries of origin cannot really make that change, especially individually, when the countries have usually relied on MOUs, which are not so easily implemented. It is difficult because labor sending countries are competing for the same kind of work that are low paying, don't have that amount, kind of rights. So for countries to ask for better rights, it's negotiating collectively is an option that could be used from South and Southeast Asian countries rather than competing for the market share and underselling their own the rights of their own migrant workers. And there's some forms, some regional consultative processes that could be used, such as the Colombo process or the Abu Dhabi process, which are on Asian labor sending and receiving countries, the region consultative processes, to kind of find common ground and discuss these issues with labor receiving countries, especially in the Gulf area. So that's how I will end it here, and happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richa. There was a tremendous amount there, so we can open up for... It's on. The light's on. So, yeah, so we can open up for questions. For those who are following online, if you put questions into the chat function on YouTube, that would be much appreciated. We can maybe start in the room, see if anybody has any questions they'd like to put to Richa to start the ball rolling. Lorenzo, microphone.
Thanks. Very interesting research and very clearly presented both in the paper and here. So thanks a lot, Richa. I have a lot of questions, so I'll try to go through some of them quickly, and you can cherry pick, of course. First, I was wondering, so you define migration bans as only targeted to female migrant workers, and I was wondering whether there are also other bans that are not for female migrant workers. Just a curiosity. Second question, maybe a bit more substantial. It seems to me you talk about crisis events that trigger these different policy responses. And it seems to me that all the crisis events that you mention are events that become very visible in the press. So I can imagine there are a lot of other cases of abuse and exploitation that are not well documented, but perhaps consulates are aware, and do they try to make them public, or that's not the case? So in other words, the question is whether you do need some kind of media visibility to trigger the crisis. Then I was wondering, it seems to me that you make a binary choice between implementing a ban and not implementing a ban. And I was asking myself whether other policy options are even contemplated. For example, strengthening grievance mechanisms, or, very Eurocentric, I guess, perspective. But when you want to retaliate against another country here, the first thing you do is normally you expel their diplomatic representatives. So whether that is even taken into account, or, for example, restrictions on visa access for citizens of the countries where exploitation happens. I don't know if that's the case at all. Then, I'm almost done. I was wondering whether associations of migrants are involved in those processes. What is their role, whether they are consulted, whether they lobby governments to take action or not, and what their position is, because they might either support or oppose a migration ban because of the reasons that you discuss in the paper. And finally, just out of curiosity, what happens when immigration ban is introduced, what happens to the citizens of the country who are in the place that is targeted by the ban? Is any measure taken to bring some of them home, or they are just ignored? Those were my questions, and again, I don't expect an answer to all of them for the interest of time, but you can pick maybe one or two. Thanks.
Thank you, Laurentia. In the interest of time, maybe just collect the questions in the room, and then you answer whatever question you want to answer, and then we go online. So I think Martin, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. So I have two questions. The first one is a bit more open. How do these bans actually work? So that's what I'm curious about. Because under international law, as far as I understand it, normally citizens of their own country have the right to leave their country, right? So it is problematic in that context. And so yeah, it's not it's not obvious how that works. I think it's I would be curious to hear more about this, and in relation to that, to what extent there is international pressure on ending these practices or not. That's the first question. And then the second question, so I think this is a very fair argument that there are these different motivations, so improving the labor conditions, for example, abroad. But how is this related to diaspora governance in general? So obviously, this will workers abroad will generate remittances. So that puts, I would have expected that would put pressure against these bans, although of course if the origin governments try to use this as leverage to improve the conditions, this might increase remittances, so it depends on how successful this is. But in relation to diaspora governance, to what extent do these policies also reflect broader notions of how states maintain relations with citizens abroad? So I work on citizenship, so the Philippines, Indonesia, Nepal, they are all countries that are characterized by also ban on dual citizenship. So they are countries that have a kind of inward-looking perspective from that perspective on the relation between the state and the citizen. So is this something that are there broader notions of nationhood or diaspora governance that play into this?
Thank you. Let's take all the questions. I realize a large number of questions, but let's just take them all in one go. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I learned a lot. My question relates to international human rights perspective. I mean, obviously, this is not a legal paper, but from an international human rights perspective, these bans are quite problematic in a sense that, for instance, I would say this is discrimination on the grounds of gender, on the grounds of marital status, or having children, but also, as you mentioned, like the age factor is sometimes a criteria taken into consideration. So I was wondering whether in your research, if you have come across any national laws, case law, just challenging these bans on the grounds of discrimination, restriction on right to work, or restriction on freedom of movement and mobility, since a female domestic worker wants to maybe really work in that kind of country and work for there. So this is a restriction on the fundamental rights. Have you come across any national cases, any court cases like constitutional courts? And if, because you mentioned some of these policies are reversed because there were rights groups campaigning, so there was there any kind of application before the international UN human rights committees like ICERD or you know, a human rights committee, if you come across any kind of practice?
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I think you mentioned in your presentation that the host countries had the option of also selecting migrants from other countries, for example, from Africa. And maybe this is outside of the realm of this specific study, but are you aware of similar bans from those countries to these countries?
All right, thank you so much for all the very interesting questions. I really appreciate it. I'll try to take a few. So I think Lorenzo, right? Yeah. Asked a really interesting question on if these bans are only for women, and usually they are. And my point so I'm from Nepal. My point is, so there's like newspaper articles that say about 3 coffins of male migrant workers come back to the country every day or more, and it's never been discussed that we should protect them, their lives, that kind of thing. It's not about protecting migrant workers as such. It's more about the gendered patriarchal norms and how it appears in the public, and we should protect more vulnerable migrant workers, that kind of thing. And for sure, like, migrant abuses happen every day. Their deaths happen every day, but not every case becomes this visible case that is really captures the public attention or the media interest. And absolutely, the consulates are aware. There are so many cases of deaths and abuse and all of that are happening. And some consulates are much more involved than others. And it's also about capacity and money that can be put in. And the Philippines has usually been quite involved in the process of helping migrant workers in their cases, but other countries don't have the resources and have difficulty doing so. So I don't think the consulates as such make it public, but they know of the many issues. And also similarly for Nepal, the numbers say there are very few migrant workers, but the women reaching out to consulates in all these countries where these bans have been there has been quite large. So the consulates know that it's not working. So yeah, it's not the only 2 policy options is not implement a ban or not. Obviously, that is not the case. There's many other options, and in a lot of ways, I think labor-sending countries are trying to do all these other options too. Some are more successful than others. The grievance mechanisms are strengthening those have been very difficult because of the transnational nature. The receiving country has to be involved and let migrant workers put these grievances. First of all, the expelling of diplomatic personnel has been used sometimes when these cases have been so big that the countries really have had to do certain issues, like after the 1995 case of the execution of fraught contemplación in Singapore. Philippines actually had a huge diplomatic role with Singapore, and also send a plane to bring back their domestic workers and such. Okay, Martin. So how do they work? The basic on how to make it more difficult for a woman to go abroad is to not give them labor permits officially. So usually every migrant worker, before they leave in many countries, let's say they have to go to a certain office, tick all the boxes, do the trainings, information sessions, all of that, healthcare certificates, and then you're given a labor permit that says you can now leave the country. So then you don't have that, you can't go to the airport and go. One way to still go is go on a visit visa or tourist visa to another country that allows you to go as a citizen, and then from there go elsewhere. Or in the case of Nepal, there's an open border to India, so you go to India and then find a way out. What was the other thing? So also the legally, they don't come so much as laws, but as policy directives, which is why they're so confusing. And it's a balance that they keep changing their directives on and off, but it makes it difficult for court cases. Let's say there have been court cases, and in the case of Nepal, then there was this announcement that the country should open it up in some ways, but then there's these parliamentary committees and they say we did this big research and they're still vulnerable, so we should still go on with it. So there's a lot of, I don't know, negotiation or conflict or something that is happening at the legal level as well. On the issue of diaspora governance, one of the reasons that the labor sending countries have become more involved, I think, overall in migrant issues, I mean, one is remittances, of course, but also because the diasporic community has become so large and the migrant population has become so large. So they've become a very important voter bank in some ways, like especially for the Philippines. It's quite interesting that the last President Duterte, he actually went to these countries in the Gulf certain countries to for his what are they called, the political speeches and things like that. So it's important because of these issues that they come in. But the ban, I think, is to also show that we're taking care of you. And for a country like Philippines, they use the ban. Even when you talk to government officials, they understand that this is not effective. But they're saying that we use this so that we can get better rights for our migrants. So it's always a signaling to their migrant workers that we're working for you. And the issue about remittances is the remittances come regardless of the ban or not, right? So it's an easy kind of way that we put this ban, women should not go, but we know they're going and they're sending back the remittances anyways. Host countries in Africa have also have the same problems, not host country, receiving countries, sending countries. And it's the same problems in Asia and Africa, and certain countries. I think Ethiopia has had a ban. So I think all these labor sending countries, and it's especially to the Middle East, that these problems are happening, and it's also because of the kafala laws and other issues that it's the same problems that are coming up. And you know, these countries could shop around, but the labor sending countries are at a disadvantage unless there's a more collective approach to the problem. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Thank you, Richa. So, well, and then over this side, I don't know, I wasn't in the room when it happened, but do you want to go
All
first,
three
Nadia?
of them had questions.
Then Erendira, then Federica.
Oh, okay, great.
Oh, it's been covered. Oh, okay. So, Erendira, do you want to answer?
So thank you. Quite, I think also I had some questions you already covered. I just have one. Precisely, you mentioned of this kind of irregularities that are fabricated precisely because of the bans. In this way, I understand it for on the supply side of the labor. And mainly the whole work that has been done is precisely, and you argue this in the paper, is because on the demand side. I did at some point a bit of research on the case of Lebanon and the kafala system, and one of the things that I found with the Facebook groups that are precisely Facebook groups that recruit all these migrant domestic workers, I saw this kind of issues of when they were bans enforced, for example, in Kuwait, people being recruited to go to another neighboring country, paid expenses, tickets, etc., just to make them cross from there the border and recruit them as domestic workers.
From Lebanon, they would go to Kuwait.
Yes.
And Kuwaitis would pay for it?
It would assume them, but it was kind of this intricate,
Yeah, right.
Precisely because, so this, it might be maybe too obvious, but how, if there might be also kind of a sort of connection between this supply and demand side creating irregularities, because it could seem to an extent that it actually benefits them both, right? Because on both sides, they could argue that that if anything happens, it's on them. So just maybe if you have any awareness or maybe just an idea of how this kind of supply demand side creates irregularities might be.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I also had questions that have been already replied, and thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. The part when you talk about the stigmatization made me think of a case I know a little bit better, Morocco, where single women would go to the Gulf countries and they would be stigmatized, saying that actually they say they go as domestic workers, but they actually are prostitutes. And this is very much the case, I think, in Morocco. I mean, it was really like something, a reality for most of the people. So I was wondering, what about the single women? In these cases, are these single? And also the comparison again with Morocco, when there are mothers, so other kinds of profile of women that are hired to go in the strawberry fields in Spain, and those are considered as examples, models of a win-win situation of immigration. So you make me think of all this. And then I was very interested in what you say about the labor diplomacy, so because I'm very interested in this soft form of diplomacy. So basically, you think that this labor diplomacy is a performative act as well, and it's a symbolic policy as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll take your question first. I mean, yeah, once you put these women domestic workers in a vulnerable position because of their irregularity, it benefits everyone except for the women workers, right? And if anything happens, it's like it was your fault. So it's the recruitment agencies, the agents. You know, there's so many process, like a lengthier process that you have to go through now, because you need tickets, you need fake documents, you need all of that. So it becomes a lot more expensive. You need to get from point A to point B. But also it's, you have to go to certain countries in a tourist visa or a visit visa, and then somehow either convert your visa status or be irregular also in the destination country. And if something happens, it's really difficult for them to reach out to their own consulates or also any grievance mechanism in the host country because they're illegal. So, I mean, I agree with you, the supply side, demand side, both is detrimental for migrant women workers and in their journeys in prior to migration, while migrating, and after coming back. Also, there's all these complications that they have to go through. On your question about the stigmatization, it's absolutely very real. On women who go abroad to work are not seen, are seen as, are they really working? What are they doing? What kind of work are they in actually? And the issue about single women, it's really difficult for single women to go because also, again, the age restrictions, 30 usually or more. So in countries like in South Asia, let's say, by then a lot of women are already married. So it's usually maybe married women or with children that they go. And what you said about mothers as examples, if they take care of their children, but also go abroad to work and bring back remittances. It's, as I said earlier, they're seen as economic heroes and, helping their family, sacrificing their lives for the betterment of the family and the country. So in Philippines, there's this whole, what is it called? There's an award Balikbayan award on like a hero. So migrants are called heroes because they're sacrificing their life and everything for their families and their country for remittances. And there's an award given to certain migrants every year, and it's a migrant day, like, so they're like kind of celebrated in some ways. So there's this distinction that countries go through, what kind of migrant, good migrant, bad migrant, you know, that kind of. Are there any questions?
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we've been certainly plenty of questions there for Richa, so hopefully that's been a useful and informative experience for everybody. So I'd like to thank Richa for her excellent presentation and for everybody who's joined us. So thank you very much.